Hello to you all. My name is Ajane Roundtree. I am your host for the evening, and welcome to the conversation with Dr. Nicholas Buccola on William Buckley and James Baldwin's conversation around race. This is a part of the A.C.T.O.R series that is a long-running conversation about race that has been hosted by Busboys and Poets. And we are collaborating with Busboys and Poets, the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race at the Carter School at George Mason. Tonight, we are in a webinar style format. So the ground rules for this format is that your videos and audio are toggled off. If you have any questions, please put them into the chat and we will get to as many as possible. This event is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. So please just sit back and relax and enjoy the conversation. I will now turn it over to founder of Busboys and Poets, Andy Shallal.
Thank you so much, Ajane. Really appreciate this. And to remind people that the Facebook is at Busboys and Poets, so you can go there and watch it. If you cannot enter it through here, or if you have a friend that wants to come in and they don't have the link, just send them there. So I'd like to welcome everyone. This series has been going on. The A.C.T.O.R series, a continuing talk on race, has been going on for quite some time. In fact, since the beginning of Busboys and Poets in 2005. This has been a monthly series that we've had when things were normal. And it's been a great series that was so much so that we really did not want to stop it with this pandemic. No pandemic shall stop us from having these conversations. So we have continued this via Zoom. We appreciate all of you for joining us and being part of this. Of course, it was great to find a partner at George Mason University, the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, and the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race. And of course, my partner in crime, Dr. Charles Chavis. It was great to meet him and get to know him and see that we have aligned a lot of our interests to come up with the series. There'll be a lot more coming up. We'll tell you about it. We're working on a radio show and other things, and we'll keep you posted on that. So I really appreciate everyone being part of this, and we'll continue to do this as long as you all are interested. So thank you again for being part of this. I was very excited. Should I introduce our speaker for today?
After Dr. Chavis. After Dr. Chavis. Introduce Dr. Chavis.
Oh, I introduced Dr. Chavis. maybe I should read the itinerary. That would help. So, Dr. Charles Chavis, take it away.
No worries. Thanks, Andy. Yes, I'm Dr. Charles Chavis. I'm the founding director of the John Mitchell Jr. Program for History, Justice, and Race. And the Mitchell program is located in an amazing school, part of George Mason University, the newly named Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And we're extremely thankful for Andy extending his platform and allowing us to be a part of these ongoing conversations during the midst of these two pandemics. It's so important that we not let these two pandemics stop us from having these conversations. The show must go on, the work must continue, and I'm so thankful for this opportunity and this partnership. Now, Andy, I think you can introduce.
Thank you so much. I'm terrible at this. I apologize. Well, Nick Buccola was someone that I met about a year ago when his book first came out, The Fire is Upon Us. And of course, anything that has Baldwin in it is something that I love and adore and want to just devour. And his book is quite remarkable and very original, the way he has it, where he talks about the debate between William Buckley and of course, James Baldwin. Very, very exciting. And if you haven't seen it, it's on YouTube. You can go there and watch the brilliance, the analysis that comes with that. He's also the author, Nick is also the author of The Political Thought of Frederick Douglass in Pursuit of American Liberty, and the editor of the Essential Douglass Writings and Speeches and Abraham Lincoln and Liberal Democracy. And of course, The Fire is Upon Us is what we're going to be talking about today. So welcome, Nick. It's a pleasure to have you here on this series.
Thank you, Andy. I'm so honored to be here. Thanks to the Busboys and Poets team, and to you, and to Charles, Ajane, Audrey, for getting everything sorted out. And it's just an honor to be part of this series. I love Busboys and Poets. It's one of my favorite places in DC, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much. So let me begin. James Baldwin is found sort of a new resurgence. I know that film that came out, I'm Not Your Negro, was something that I think a lot of people got to get a glimpse of James Baldwin's brilliance and his background. And I know there's been a lot of conversation about James Baldwin, including when Toni Morrison compared Ta-Nehisi Coates to the new James Baldwin. I think people started questioning, who is this guy? People that didn't know James Baldwin, didn't know much about him, started looking into him a little bit more. So there's been this huge resurgence that has happened. What do you attribute that resurgence to, Nick?
That's a great question, Andy. Yeah, it is definitely, there's been a Baldwin renaissance of sorts over the last few years, not only in the academic world, but in the popular culture generally. And, it's always one of those difficult things to pinpoint why this is happening. But I think one of the reasons it's happening is that Baldwin speaks to questions, speaks to themes that are absolutely as urgent and relevant as ever. And so Baldwin's ideas were always urgent and relevant. The things that he was concerned with were always urgent and relevant. But I think as the kind of, the general popular culture has, become more attentive to these things that should always be urgent in our minds, Baldwin has been a tremendous resource because he's somebody who is coming at all of these questions, these fundamental human questions about who we take ourselves to be as individuals, who we take ourselves to be as members of communities, and why we treat one another the way we do. And so Baldwin was always kind of probing those existential questions. And of course, he was, as Malcolm X called him, the poet of the Civil Rights Revolution, right? Somebody who was putting pen to paper and trying to explain, as he said, tried to witness what he was experiencing and what those around him were experiencing. And there's something about that in his own time that's so relevant to us today. But I think also Baldwin's enduring relevance is that he does speak to these questions that are these fundamentally human questions that we are grappling with. And whether anytime you're reading the headlines or just experiencing your life, there's a way in which Baldwin has such a powerful lens to give you to try to understand what's happening around you and try to understand what's happening inside yourself.
Yeah, his brilliance, of course, goes from writing essays and really deep, insightful, philosophical analysis of race and race relations in America to writing fiction, with some of the most beautiful written fiction. I have read Giovanni's Room, I think 3 or 4 times. And each time I read it, I find incredible jewels of just beautiful prose. It's just so beautiful. If you haven't read it, folks, I really urge you. It's a great read to be able to do. My impression is that James Baldwin's writing is as relevant today as it ever was. We still a lot of the issues that he dealt with and he talks about are still very relevant today, and almost like as if you're reading him now. Of course, he wrote in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, but he seems to be on time, which is disturbing in a sense, because you would think that we have moved a little bit past this. What's your impression of how much have we evolved? Let me rephrase it. Of all the writings that you've seen, what writer on these issues that James Baldwin writes about has taken us to the next tier? Because I feel like Baldwin had kind of really set the standard for these types of conversations. And I personally have not seen much evolution in that conversation since. What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a series of great questions there. I mean, as you said in your mention of Giovanni's Room, I mean, Baldwin is somebody who's writing in every genre, right? And he's in one of the things that I think Baldwin's quest in life, right, is to try through his characters in his fiction through the subjects in his nonfiction writing and his journalism. He's trying to provide his readers with the opportunity to see the world through the eyes of others, right? And so you think about Baldwin. I mean, late in life, he's interviewed, and the interviewer begins the program by saying, James Baldwin, you were born poor, black, and gay. Did you ever wonder how unlucky can I get? And Baldwin says, I think I hit the jackpot. And I think Baldwin was kind of making a joke, but he says, there's something about my life that is, he uses the word outrageous, right? And Baldwin's, there's something about the way Baldwin viewed the world from the margins of the margins, is able to describe what that world looked like, not only through his own experience, but the experience of those around him. And I think because, this is where you make the point, Andy, that Baldwin is so sadly relevant to our times today, because the inequalities, the racism, the homophobia, the xenophobia, all these things that he's writing about, 50, 60 years ago, through his writing career, these things are still absolutely central to our lives, right? And so Baldwin is trying to help us understand what is at the root of those things. He's always asking us to ask this question, what lies beneath, right? Because there's something about us as human beings, as individuals, and as members of communities that we tend to construct identities for ourselves that make us feel safe. And often that sort of quest for safety leads us to treat one another inhumanely. And that's at the core of Baldwin's project. So I think that's absolutely central. And so thinking about, from Baldwin's doing that work and the time he's doing that work to today, obviously that's it's a long story. But I think one of the things that sort of thinking about the bridge between Baldwin and people doing that sort of work today is that, there's all sorts of really powerful, and it's always dangerous to list, names, in terms of people doing the sort of work that Baldwin was calling on us to do. But there's so many writers out there today that, are following Baldwin's, basic instruction to us as, as writers, as individuals, as artists, whatever we want to define ourselves. Baldwin really it tells us that the fundamental thing we need to do is to look into ourselves, to really examine our own experiences and to be honest about what we see. Baldwin says that is something that fundamentally is terrifying for us as human beings, because we often don't want to come to terms with who we really are and why we act the way that we do. And so Baldwin is really this kind of existential detective. I mean, he's somebody who really wants us to engage in a kind of ruthless introspection about the way we live, and to interrogate ourselves and interrogate those around us about the delusions under which we live. And he thinks that fundamentally, there's so many delusions that we rely upon to make ourselves feel safe. And those delusions are leading us not only to treat others inhumanely, but to fundamentally undermine our own dignity as individuals. That's fundamental to the Baldwin project. And so, there's so much great work, going on. I just finished Natasha Trethewey's Memorial Drive this weekend. Kiese Lehman, Heavy. There's all sorts of work that I think is being done where people are really looking into themselves and looking into their own lives and thinking about their experiences and thinking about the experiences of those that they love, and trying to really be honest about what they see and try to understand the ways in which structures of power we see around us are shaping our lives in so many ways. And when those structures of power are unjust, we have a responsibility. This is another central Baldwin point. We have a responsibility to alter those structures of power to achieve a more just world.
Well said. Well said. Charles.
Yeah. So the theologian in me is kind of coming out. So this, when I think of, Baldwin, I think of other leaders and or literary giants in terms of the Black freedom struggle and the long civil rights movement, right? So placing Baldwin in this larger ilk of leaders and pioneers, specifically as relates to naming and dealing with teasing out this whole idea of systemic racism and the ways in which it is entrenched throughout every part of the American experiment, right? I think about, as what Cornel West calls this Black prophetic fire, right? So where do you think Baldwin fits in terms of the long civil rights movement, right? If we were able to go further back, right? You should know a lot about this. Your first book was on Douglass, right? I put Douglass in the same category, right? In terms of having this relevance and speaking to the current moment. And I think about Ida B. Wells, right? And others who their words are just so relevant in this current age, and their words are alive and well with us today. Could you speak a little bit about how you see Baldwin in terms of the long civil rights movement, and as we look at the Black freedom struggle throughout the history of this country.
Yeah, that's a great question, Charles. You know, I think that, you know, using that Dr. West terminology, right? This Black prophetic fire, this tradition that you're talking about, I think is right on. I mean, Baldwin is somebody who, from a very young age, is obsessed with books. He's obsessed with language, right? He talks about growing up in Harlem and reading every book he could get his hands on, the library closest to where he lived, adventuring out, you know, outside of the bounds where he was supposed to go to find more books, and trying to find a kind of language to make sense of his own experience, right? And then beginning to set pen to paper in order to try to explain, try to understand what he was living in Harlem in those years. And so I think thinking of Baldwin in that way as part of this, you know, this long civil rights tradition, right? This kind of, you know, in some ways going back, right, to 1619, and in some ways thinking about this long tradition of resistance and resilience. I think that's absolutely the way we ought to think about Baldwin. And yeah, I mean, there's something about Baldwin. There's so much to say about, you know, situating Baldwin in the tradition you're talking about. Douglass, Ida B. Wells, Du Bois, you know, in some of Baldwin's contemporaries, Anna Julia Cooper, some of the people that we were talking about before we went on air. I mean, Baldwin is somebody who is very much steeped in that tradition, and also doing something that to me is, you know, is different, right? I mean, Baldwin is somebody who is certainly, you know, for me, my background is in political theory, right? So when I first really was encountering Baldwin in a serious way, I found him to be immensely challenging. I'm used to dealing with particular categories of thought and political theory that you know, sort of, I know what to expect in terms of the formulation of an argument in kind of a political philosophical sense. But Baldwin is operating on this whole other level, which I think is so powerful, and in many ways, as you're saying, draws on this tradition that you know, that he's part of. But yeah, Baldwin is really he's trying to engage in the sort of work that somebody like Douglass or somebody like Cooper or somebody like Du Bois is engaged in, but he's doing it in this way that is uniquely his own, right? I've never read anybody, you know, like Baldwin. I think he really he's sort of in this other category for me. But he's thinking about these sort of basic questions of the way we live, and the way we live on a kind of level of identity, right? For Baldwin, it always comes back to this sort of nexus of identity, morality, and power, right? Who do we take ourselves to be, and why is it that we're constructing our identities in the way that we are, and how is that construction of identity really rooted in things that we don't want to talk about, and sort of questions that we don't want to address. And so I think that's fundamentally, you know, I think, you know, Eddie Glaude in his new book calls this, you know, the lie, right? There's so much about the lie, the capital L lie, that dominates our lives. And I think Baldwin is you know, his central to his project is really trying to examine that, the big lie, and also the lies that we live by, right? The lies that we live by in order to avoid coming to terms with who we really are. And so, I think of Baldwin as definitely in that tradition. And also, I mean, just one more point about this is that I think Baldwin is really powerful to me as somebody who always has this kind of critical distance, right? So he's part of this tradition that you're talking about, but he's also somebody who's there to, you know, ask the tough question. One of my favorite Baldwin lines, right, is to drive to the heart of every answer to expose the question that it hides, right? And so Baldwin is always there. So like when he, very early on, he's 24 years old. One of the first book reviews he writes is of a biography of Frederick Douglass called The Heroic Slave, right? And Baldwin says, you know, we cannot pretend that Frederick Douglass was superhuman. He was a human just like you and me. And so if we tell stories about somebody like Frederick Douglass that make him into something more than human, then we're doing him a disservice. We're undermining his dignity as a human being. And so Baldwin is always, you know, and he does that throughout the tradition, right? He's engaging Douglass, he's engaging Du Bois, and he's, you know, engaging some of his contemporaries. He's always there to ask these hard questions. And so I think there's something about Baldwin that, you know, there's a number of folks who have written, including Professor West, have written about Baldwin as the Black American Socrates, right? He's always there to ask questions. He's that kind of gadfly who's asking these really difficult philosophical questions. And so I think that is a special role for him in the tradition that is extraordinarily valuable and enduring.
Wow, thank you so much.
I wanted to follow up a little bit about many of the writers of the Harlem Renaissance and beyond during Baldwin's time um, found it very difficult to live in America under the conditions that they had to live under. Many of them left this country. They went to live in Paris. They went to live. I recently learned that that Baldwin lived in Istanbul for quite some time. In fact, I think he wrote The Fire Next Time there, if I'm not mistaken. But the lens that you see America with by leaving America first was really essential for many of these writers to understand their position and their humanity in a different way. America tend to, be very myopic, and when you live in it, you really don't see it. How important was that, do you think, for Baldwin, for him to see that? And I know when he lived in Paris, it was after the Birmingham bombing that he recognized that he needs to be back here. He needs to be back here to fight the civil rights struggles that needed to be fought. He thought he didn't want to abandon his people. Can you speak a little bit more about that part of his growth?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. That's a really important question. Yeah, Baldwin, so Baldwin actually leaves the United States in 1948, and he is in Paris. And one of the things that Baldwin describes, he never thinks of himself as an exile or as an expatriate. He says, "I'm a transatlantic commuter. I cannot be anything other than an American at my core." That's something Baldwin always really believed. But Baldwin, in 1948, he leaves, and he describes in very powerful detail in a number of his writings, his autobiographical writings, why he felt the need to leave. He said, I got to the point, he really watches his father, David Baldwin Sr., consumed by despair, right? He watches his father consumed by a kind of self-hatred and a sort of cruelty to others. And he sort of sees that he wants to avoid that path. He sees his father sort of crumble before his very eyes. And he sees one of his best friends, Eugene Wirth, this young idealist, socialist, radical young man. He watches Eugene Wirth sort of consumed by despair, and he commits suicide, jumps off the George Washington Bridge. And so Baldwin himself kind of knows that is a path that could take him. And he also sees, he says that I not only recognize that I could destroy myself, but he describes very vividly in the essay Notes of a Native Son, the experience of feeling like he had the rage in him to kill another person, right? And he wants to avoid that as well. He wants to try to find a sort of an avenue other than that avenue of despair. And so Baldwin leaves, and as you said, Andy, he needs to find that kind of critical distance in order to sort of reflect. He's trying to write about his experiences growing up in Harlem. He's trying to write what will be his, autobiographical novel, Go Tell on the Mountain. He's struggling, and he finally is able to write that book from, finishes it in a Swiss village, right? He describes really powerfully the experience of finishing that book in an essay called Stranger in the Village. And there's something about that distance, right? And I really have become obsessed and fascinated by this question of the spaces in which we write, and Baldwin and the spaces in which we think. And Baldwin says, he's in this Swiss village, and he's listening to Bessie Smith. He says, basically, I have my liquor, I have my typewriter, I have my record player, and I have Bessie Smith. And he's just writing, and he says, I'm really hearing Bessie Smith for the first time. In that Swiss chalet, he's hearing Bessie Smith for the first time. So there's something about that distance that allows him the space to really reflect on his own life in Harlem and what the life that he'd experienced was, and the life of those around him was like. And so Baldwin, as you said, he found extraordinary productivity in Istanbul. It's where he finishes Another Country. It's where he writes a lot of what will become the book, The Fire Next Time. So he's somebody who is really, and he's very conscious of this. He knows that he can't write in New York, period. It's almost impossible for him to write in New York. So he's able to find these moments in his life where these spaces in which he can actually think and actually write. And there's something about leaving, right? But then feeling, as you said, this tension is fundamental to Baldwin and who he is, this feeling of obligation to come back. So it's actually a little bit before the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in the late 50s. Baldwin is seeing, images on newspapers of school integration, right? And seeing the way that, these white mobs are reacting to the integration of schools and that slow process that we're still trying to go through of integrating our educational system. And Baldwin says, you know, I can't just sit here in Paris and write about these things. I have to go back. And so it's in the late 50s when he makes his first trip to the American South. And it's a really, for me as a writer and writing The Fires Upon Us, that to me was the most powerful moment, because I'm describing William F. Buckley, who is in that moment rationalizing resistance to Black liberation, right? He's coming up with every argument under the sun to resist the Civil Rights Revolution. And it's in that very moment when Buckley and his crew are rationalizing their resistance that Baldwin makes his first trip to the American South. So to have Baldwin, you know, sort of in that backdrop of all these conservatives trying to rationalize resistance, Baldwin then sitting in the living room of a 15-year-old boy who's the first African-American student at a previously all-white school in Charlotte, North Carolina, that to me as a writer was like, this is it. This is like thinking about these things in these two different ways, going back and forth between this Buckley worldview and this Baldwin worldview. That's the story that I need to tell here. And so I think that's a long-winded way of saying that, yeah, Baldwin did feel that obligation to go back, and he always felt this tension between his obligations as a kind of public figure, as a kind of activist, and his obligations as a writer, as an artist. And that's something that was an enduring tension in his life until the end.
Very good. Charles, do we want to open it up for the audience, or would you like to ask another question?
I think we can go ahead and open it up to the audience. I did have one follow-up, but I'll wait until after we engage the audience a little bit.
I can talk to Nicholas forever. I know that one of the things that came out of your attendance at the event of Busboys and Poets, we started the James Baldwin Book Club, which you helped us launch, and so it's a book club about about 12 people that meet regularly, and we've read almost every book of Baldwin's so far. It's been a really exciting journey.
Well, that's what, yeah. If more people read Baldwin, you know, anything that any of us can do to get more people to read Baldwin, we're doing a good thing for humanity, as far as I'm concerned.
Exactly. Let's go ahead and go to a clip right now. We have several clips. I think it would be great if we can get into the discussion about the book specifically and the debate. So let's go ahead and transition to one of the first clips that we have.
Okay, yeah, great. So, and just to set this up for the audience, I know some folks have, you know, watched the debate. There's a BBC recording of the debate available on YouTube. You should definitely check it out if you have not. And I'm going to play a couple of clips of it. But just to give a little bit of background for those who maybe are more familiar with one or the other of the debaters. So you have Baldwin, who we've discussed in great detail, invited to the Cambridge Union, the world's oldest debating society. This debating society had just celebrated its 150th anniversary. It's in England. It's on this elite university campus. And he's invited to this debating society to debate the motion, the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. So that was the motion before the House that night. And the debater that they choose to be opposite Baldwin, as has been mentioned, is William F. Buckley Jr. And the thing to know about Buckley, for those of you who haven't thought about him in a while or haven't heard of him, Buckley was at that time second only to Barry Goldwater, is the most prominent conservative in the United States. So Buckley was somebody who was born to immense privilege. He's born only 15 months after Baldwin, and he grows up on a 47-acre estate. He's somebody who has every possible privilege you can imagine, and he's taught a very specific kind of elitism growing up, and that elitism basically was that some people are fit to rule and other people are fit to be ruled. And Buckley's parents taught him a very thoroughly racialized elitism as well. And so I talk about that in some detail in the book. And so in the years leading up to the debate with Baldwin, Buckley establishes himself as really a founding father of the American conservative movement. And he plays this kind of outsized role as a founding father because he sort of has he has many platforms. He founds a magazine, National Review, in 1955. He has a newspaper column 3 times a week. He's on radio, television. He's traveling around the country. So he's really a leading conservative public intellectual. And he's been absolutely clear from the beginning of his public career that he's adamantly opposed to the Civil Rights Revolution. So he's against Brown v. Board, school desegregation. He ends up being against the Civil Rights Act, against the Voting Rights Act. He's a critic of Martin Luther King. He's a critic of the student sit-in protesters, critic of the Freedom Riders. So he is there on this stage with Baldwin to discuss this motion, the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. So what we'll do first is I'll play so Baldwin, two students get up and speak in this debate at Cambridge, and then Baldwin is invited to speak. And I'm just going to play a short clip from Baldwin, and then we'll talk about it a little bit, and then we can play a clip from Buckley as well. So let me just pull this up. So here's James Baldwin.
And in the moment you are born, since you don't know any better, every stick and stone and every face is white. And since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover the flag to which you have pledged allegiance along with everybody else has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another, only on the basis of the color of their skins, begins there and accelerates throughout a whole lifetime. So that presently you realize you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen. By the time you are 30, you have been through a certain kind of mill. And the most serious effect of the mill you've been through is, again, not the catalog of disaster. The policemen, the taxi drivers, the waiters, the landlady, the landlord, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details, 24 hours of every day, which spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It is not that. It's by that time you've begun to see it happening in your daughter or your son or your niece or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you to escape the trap. But what is worse than that is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from meeting the same disaster and not impossibly coming to the same end.
I kept looking for the teleprompter.
No teleprompter. Yeah, one of the amazing things at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, where Baldwin's papers are now, is, you know, he kept the hotel stationery where he scribbled a few notes before the debate. So you can actually look at the original little, you know, just a few, and he hardly peeks at his notes, of course. He just delivers that amazing sermon. So you could see from that clip, you could watch that all night, right? Just Baldwin doing his thing. But yeah, I thought that'd be a nice clip to sort of, you know, the basis of some conversation about Baldwin's speech, and we can talk about Buckley's speech later if we have time. But that's a little taste of what Baldwin has to say.
He had a lot of prep for this because he was a young preacher. And, you know, when he was, 14 or something, he started preaching in his church. And, you know, so he was able to command the room of predominantly white people, you know, a packed room in a very high profile debate, and be so incredibly in control. That was really remarkable. It gives you goosebumps to watch it and hear it actually every single time. And I've watched it probably 10 times.
Yeah. Well, I've watched it, you know, hundreds, if not thousands by now. But yeah, absolutely. I agree. I mean, there's something about, you know, something about that moment that's so amazing, right? You have the world's oldest debating society that chamber had witnessed, you know, so many debates, but that chamber had never witnessed anything like James Baldwin that night, right? Because he says, as you said, Andy, right when he gets up there, the first thing he says is I'm here as a kind of Jeremiah, right? He's announcing he is there to deliver a sermon, right? He's there to deliver a kind of a sermon that people do not want to hear. He's there to deliver a, mournful lamentation about the disease of white supremacy. And so Baldwin delivers that sermon that night, and it is this predominantly white, an elite space, if there ever was one, the Cambridge Union at the University of Cambridge. And he's there to deliver a sermon. And of course, his audience goes beyond that chamber to the world, right? And now that video has millions of views, right? And people watch that and have a lot of different reactions to it. But yeah, you're exactly right. Baldwin is there. He left the pulpit at the age of 17, but he remained forever a preacher, and he delivers an extraordinary sermon that night.
Yep. Back to the sermon piece, you mentioned that he evokes the book of Jeremiah, and so I thought about Hebrew Bible specifically as it relates to Jeremiah and the whole idea of this fire, right? And I said we weren't going to be too deep, but I wanted to dig into this whole usage of fire and what this means, specifically looking at and considering his tradition within the Black church. Because as Andy mentioned, very few speakers are able to captivate any type of room the way that Baldwin does, but it reminds you so much of the black preacher across the board in many ways. So could you speak to that specifically as to what this fire means, and specifically in the life of Baldwin, specifically?
Yeah. Thank you, Charles. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I, as I mentioned to you before we came on, I mean, that's something that I thought a lot about, this use of fire. Yeah, and certainly thinking about the idea of fire in the prophetic tradition and the ways in which it's there, for Baldwin, it's always there, right? And it's used in so many different ways. And I think, in this moment, right, 1965, something about this, the period in which this happened in history, in Baldwin's own life, in the history of the country, and also the history of the world, that's significant, right? February 1965, in many ways, it's a kind of high tide of the civil rights movement, that phase in the civil rights movement, at least, right? And you're in the midst of the Selma campaign. So the same night Baldwin and Buckley are debating at Cambridge, across the ocean, you have a group of protesters, marching in Marion, Alabama. It's the night that Jimmy Lee Jackson is mortally wounded by Alabama law enforcement. And so Baldwin is in many ways is in a moment when, in terms of his own intellectual life, his own spiritual life, in a sense, his hope is really at a high point in some ways. He had been hoping, you see that hope coming through, right, in those last pages of The Fire Next Time, which I think are that kind of hope that you can see in those last few pages of The Fire Next Time, where Baldwin is imagining what it might look like for us to achieve the level of consciousness that would permit us to achieve our country, right, to come together and achieve our country. So there's something about that when, I tell people that The Fire Next Time for Baldwin in 1962, 63, through to this moment in 65, when he's talking about The Fire Next Time, it's not a wish, it's a warning, right? He's calling on people to achieve a level of consciousness that will allow us to avoid a fire, right, in the sense of, I think in that kind of prophetic sense, where the fire that he's talking about in that context is not something, is something that he wants us to try to avoid, right? So that's something that I think is, and you can speak, much better to that in the tradition than I can, Charles, in terms of the theology behind that. One thing I was going to point out, and we were talking about this a little bit before we came on, is that fire also there's other moments in Baldwin's writing where fire has this different resonance. So he talks about, he says freedom is the fire that burns away illusion, right? So there's something about fire in that context where he's saying that fire can actually, and maybe we can find a way to connect these two things. But yeah, Baldwin is definitely, he's there in the Cambridge speech doing a little bit of both, right? He's there as the warning prophet, right? He's there in this space, again, trying so desperately to get people to listen, to get people like, not only people like William F. Buckley to listen, but people who think of themselves as on the right side of history, but Baldwin is there to tell them, no, you're not doing nearly enough. None of us are doing nearly enough. We are all complicit in these structures of power that allow so many people to not be able to achieve, freedom and fulfillment. So Baldwin is there in that prophetic role to always say yes, but. And then at the same time, he's calling on us to, that fire, we need to use that fire towards something good, towards something just, towards something that has the potential to liberate. So yeah, there's a lot going on, and so one of these, another night we'll have to have another Zoom session, Charles, and we can sort out that fire, right? Because there's so much there that is still, I still turn it around in my mind is exactly what fire means for Baldwin. It's another one of these ideas I think is, he's always raising questions for us to reflect on. Thank you so much. I mean, and just to continue piggyback off that, I think it brings me to the current moment that we find ourselves in, right? Some people have said we're in the midst of two pandemics. Well, that was a theme for our conversation with Dr. Eddie Glaude. But, in many ways, the fire represents the current reckoning that we find ourselves in right now, right? And someone in the chat put, fire burns away the illusion. The fire is not a wish, but a warning. I think in many ways it takes reckonings of sorts of this kind, because I think it's very important for us to understand that what we're currently seeing in terms of what happened to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the like happens to thousands of Black and brown people every day in this country. But it's certain periods, right? Certain times in our lives that are transformative. It's almost like everything comes together, right? And I think that is definitely what Baldwin is alluding to, but I really want to get your thoughts on what a conversation like this would look like today, right? If the fire is upon us. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's everything you said is so true. And this is something that Baldwin, I think one of the things that's most valuable about the lens that he gives us is precisely this point you just made, Charles, is that we have in this moment, right, this, the kind of spirit of the times is treating these questions as all of a sudden urgent. And Baldwin is there to say, and you're here to say, Charles just said it, right? These questions are always, every day, urgent for folks at the margins, right? And so this idea that they are all of a sudden urgent, Baldwin would say, what are you, that this is part of the illusion. This is part of the delusion. This is happening in the million, as he says in the Cambridge speech, in the clip we just looked at, the millions of details of every day, right? That are, in a sense, that knee on the neck, right? And that way in which there's millions of details of every day, as he says in that clip, that communicate to me, James Baldwin, that my life does not matter, right? And that is something that, so as you said, this reckoning, right? That we are, to the extent that we can, each one of us individually, and then of course acting collectively, recognize that the fire is indeed upon us, and it has been upon us for a long time. Maybe that's that combination of both fire in the negative sense and in the positive that Baldwin had in mind. This is a moment that I think Baldwin would say, if this isn't going to burn away the illusion, and the delusion by which we live, what can, right? And so I think that's absolutely crucial. And so in this moment now, right, and this is where I think that it's really, imagining what Baldwin v. Buckley, this sort of conversation looks like today, is a really, really good question, because one of the things that comes up for folks as they watch Baldwin at Cambridge is a kind of sense of discomfort, right? To see James Baldwin 55 years ago in this predominantly white space, this elite space, having to assert his humanity, right? Having to assert that his life matters. There's something about that, I know I've, in talking about the book around the country, folks who remembered watching it back in the 60s and what it meant for their family to watch it, and the pain in some ways of watching Baldwin in that space and watching Buckley react the way he does. And so to imagine, so we now go 55 years later, and as both you and Andy have already said, Baldwin could be saying the exact same thing now that he was saying then. So what does it mean now to have this sort of a conversation? And to what extent, you know, Baldwin says at the end of his speech in another, you know, really powerful part, he says, what concerns me most is that the very authority of discourse, the very authority of reason has so broken down that we cannot communicate with one another. And that's what he says. That's what concerns him most in 1965. And look where we are today, you know, in terms of the authority of reason, the authority of discourse. Where are we? How are we able to communicate with each other? How do we go forward and actually, you know, realize justice in this world? What does that look like? So that to me is a really complicated thing. So I think having conversations, right? And there's, you know, there's definitely, I think there is a kind of role to play for conversations like the one that Baldwin and Buckley were having, but we also need to be cognizant of that very haunting thing that concerned Baldwin, that should be very much of concern to anyone today, is that how can we have conversations in a context in which the humanity of some of us is being denied, right? And that's something that is, I think, was always a haunting, you know, issue for Baldwin, and he certainly there were conversations that he refused to be a part of because of that. So exactly where to draw that line, I think we have to constantly be reflecting on that. But I think that's a really great question, Charles, and I thank you for asking it.
The debate was really frustrating to watch, I have to admit, because I mean, to watch the aloofness by which Buckley gets up and starts talking about these issues, you know, you could tell there's a huge difference from where they come from. You know, Baldwin comes from a passionate personal experience, whereas Buckley is just being philosophical and sort of like dismissive in so much and the way that he presents himself, his body language, his words, the way he presents himself is very dismissive to what the urgency that Baldwin speaks to. And, you know, rightly enough, he lost the debate by quite a bit. Buckley did.
Yeah. I mean, there's something about, you know, Buckley is his, you know, he's one of a kind, and you know, Buckley is this, in many ways, is sort of like
he's like the Tucker Carlson or something.
right. I mean, Buckley is, you know, he's a performer, right? He's performing conservatism, right, with his aloofness, with his, you know, this kind of aristocratic way of communicating. And yeah, there's something about the exchange and the way Buckley reacts, and also, you know, Baldwin's reactions to Buckley, right? There was, you know, Baldwin sort of watching Buckley do his thing. And, you know, Baldwin says later, when he's asked about this encounter with Buckley, he had two encounters with Buckley, this one in February of '65 at Cambridge, and then about 3 months later, they met in New York on the television program Open End and had a 2-hour conversation there. And when Baldwin is reflecting on his encounters with Buckley a few years later in 1968, he says that, you know, basically, he says, Buckley is a bully. He refuses to listen. And Baldwin says that what I should have done, and this is in the context of the reflections on the open-end conversation, he says, I tried to engage him, I tried to reason with him, but what I should have done is hit him over the head with my coffee cup. And Baldwin was making a joke there, but it was a joke that had a very serious point at its core, right? And it goes back to that idea of what concerned him most, you know, at Cambridge, is that, you know, Buckley, and he, you know, he does this in such, as you said, frustrating terms at Cambridge. Here is William F. Buckley sitting in that space, right, feet away from James Baldwin as he delivers this, as you said, a very personal testimony, sermon about white supremacy and the ways in which white supremacy destroys the lives of both the subjugated, as Baldwin calls them, and the subjugators. So he's delivered this incredible sermon, and there is Buckley with an opportunity to listen and to sort of say, what would happen if I took Baldwin seriously in this moment? And instead, he gets up and he's extraordinarily dismissive. Do you want me to play just that 2-minute clip from Buckley to give the audience a sense of this?
Yeah,
It'd be worth to see the juxtaposition of how they, just from an emotional and presentation point of view.
Yeah. All right, so here is Buckley.
the contempt which he so eloquently showers upon us. It is impossible, in my judgment, to deal with the indictment of Mr. Baldwin unless one is prepared to deal with him as a white man. Unless one is prepared to say to him, the fact that your skin is black is utterly irrelevant to the arguments that you raise. The fact that you sit here, as is your rhetorical device, and lay the entire weight of the Negro ordeal on your own shoulders is irrelevant to the argument that we are here to discuss. The gravamen of Mr. Baldwin's charges against America are not so much that our civilization has failed him and his people, that our ideals are insufficient, but that we have no ideals. That our ideals rather are some sort of a superficial coating which we come up with at any given moment in order to justify whatever commercial and noxious experiment we are engaged in. Thus, Mr. Baldwin can write his book, The Fire Next Time, in which he threatens America. He didn't, in writing that book, speak with the British accents that he used exclusively tonight, in which he threatened America with the necessity for us to jettison our entire civilization. The only thing that the white man has that the Negro should want, he said, is power. And he is treated from coast to coast.
All right, so I'm sure the audience wants to see all of Buckley's speech, but we'll cut him off there. But yeah, that just illustrates what you're talking about, the dismissiveness. And there's a lot we can unpack there in terms of what Buckley has to say. But I think there's something very revealing about it in ways that he did not intend, about the way he responds to Baldwin.
Well, the best part about it is the facial expressions of Baldwin.
Exactly, yeah. I was
Yes.
going to do the same thing. Yeah, I think in terms of just, I'm just thinking with conflict resolution lanes, this whole idea of contentious politics, right? And, this exercise evoking Charles Tilly, it's like, this is what contentious politics looks like in terms of this debate. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to look at the current moment, right? What this would look like. And I mean, I find it the same way that, Baldwin's work and responses are prophetic. I think that Buckley's reflections speak to a similar voice that we're seeing within the larger conservative movement, right? That seeks to suggest that the systemic problems are an illusion, right? And I think that's what the trouble with the current moment that I find, and that's currently the debate that's being levied against the current movement to promote anti-racism, right? That, okay, yes, they're crazy out there who are blatantly and overtly racist, but this whole systemic thing is an illusion.
Mm.
Right.
Were the terms white privilege and white supremacy present during that time?
I mean, Baldwin uses the term white supremacy in his speech. White privilege, I don't know. Charles, you know if that terminology was used?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, but Charles, everything you just said is absolutely right on. I mean, Buckley, in that, there's a couple things there that are just to pull out that I think are absolutely relevant to where we are today. First, in that little clip that I played, right? Buckley, part of what Buckley does is to try to, sort of construct Baldwin as a threat, right? As he says later in the speech, he is a threat to the faith of our fathers, right? He's a threat to Western civilization. And Buckley had been writing that for years leading up to the debate. And of course, it's a theme of his speech that night. And you can see Baldwin's reactions, right? Are, as Andy said, very telling. So, I mean, you can, of course, see this now, right? If you turn on Tucker Carlson tonight, I'm sorry that if you have to do that, but if you do, you'll see almost the exact same rhetoric, right? Of framing people calling for structural change as a threat, right? And a threat in a particular way, right? Not a sort of a threat to you as to what you hold dear, to your identity, to what you rightfully possess, and so on. That's definitely absolutely central. And then the other point that you made, Charles, is absolutely crucial to the end. At the end of Buckley's speech, he comes around to this idea that, he says the race problem, as he calls it, in the United States is the product of an unfortunate conjunction, is the phrase that Buckley uses. And on one side of that conjunction is there are individual racist white people out there. There are a few bad apples out there, and that they need to be convinced not to be so racist. So there's something about that that's really interesting, right? He uses the term individual racist, right? So he's trying to say this is about individual behavior. This is not a systemic problem. And he's also, in framing it that way, excluding himself from the category of racism. So resisting Black liberation, as he had done for over a decade at that point, that wasn't racist. That had nothing to do with, that was not racist. That was a matter of constitutional principle, blah, 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 right? And then he says the other part of the conjunction, right? So you have individual racists, and then he says, quote unquote, failures of the Negro community to take advantage of the opportunities that exist, right? So for Buckley, he's doing everything he can rhetorically to draw our attention away from the structures of power, right? That are determining the lives of so many people. And so that's absolutely crucial, right? Again, we could flip on the news right now and see the exact same narrative repeated again and again to try to convince us that there is, again, this ways in which we distract ourselves from these structural questions. So I think that's absolutely right to bring, thank you, Charles, for bringing that to folks' attention.
Great.
Yeah, he also, he didn't refer to the idea of this is that what Baldwin was speaking about was a threat to white people. He said a threat to our civilization. So it was interesting and very telling in how he saw himself, that this is his world, and his world is being shook, and he wasn't going to have it.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's something, and Buckley does this, I think probably unintentionally, and again, he reveals too much. I mean, yeah. his most infamous piece on race was called "Why the South Must Prevail," and of course, and it's basically a piece, in which he defends, very explicit terms, the idea that he says, basically white people ought to dominate the South because, and I'm quoting Buckley, they are for the time being the advanced race. That's what he says. So really, I mean, what he's saying there is why the white South must prevail, right? But he doesn't have to say it. This is our civilization. He ends the speech at Cambridge by saying, we, right? We, if folks follow Baldwin and his radical proposals, then we have to protect our civilization from people like him and people like Bayard Rustin. He calls out Bayard Rustin as well at that point in the speech. And so he basically, and he frames it as this kind of race war. And what he does is he situates himself and people like him in the role of the allies, and he situates Baldwin and Rustin as the would-be Nazis in his analogy. And that's something Buckley did that again and again in his writing. And so there's a lot to unpack there, but we can see that playing out again. I mean, go watch, President Trump's speech in South Dakota a few weeks ago. And you're going to see almost the exact same narratives being, that are, again, we're still stuck in this rhythm, in this cycle, and people are still buying it.
But I think we can go to a couple questions from the audience here. Ajane, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we have quite a few questions. Thanks so much, everyone, for contributing your questions. The first question, Baldwin speaks of allegiance in the clip. What is allegiance, and why has America not pledged allegiance to Black people? And how does this failure to reciprocate allegiance result in the inability for some to assert that Black lives matter?
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, one of those many incredible lines in that speech, the idea of pledging allegiance to a flag that has not pledged its allegiance to you. I think, Baldwin is somebody who, in the course of the speech, right, the clip that we looked at is, you can see, again, the motion is the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro, right? So when the first time you watch the speech, I think both speeches, you sort of think about, okay, in what ways have each of these speeches, spoken to the motion, in what ways have they not, or in what ways are they speaking to the motion in a subtle way? But yeah, this question of allegiance, I think, is crucial. Baldwin, later in the speech, he makes this big point of saying, look, I am not a ward of America. I am one of the people who built the country, right? And he says, in another powerful clip just after the one we looked at, is when Baldwin says, and he says, I mean this quite literally. I picked the cotton. I built the railroads. And I did it for nothing, right? So there's a way in which Baldwin wants us to break out of this mindset, right? This whole framing of the issue, George Baldwin crazy, and this goes through, American history, right? The framing of the issue as the quote unquote Negro problem, right? Baldwin is saying, we're not the problem, right? Baldwin's saying again and again, we are not the problem. The problem has been created for reasons that have nothing to do with us. And until we can get at those reasons, we're going to be stuck in this cycle. And so Baldwin is, I think very, very powerfully thinking about what this means to be excluded from the allegiance of this country of which we are a part. Baldwin's saying we are the people who we are among the people who built the country. And as long as you keep framing this as we and us, the way Buckley does that so clearly in his speech and in his writings, we're never going to get anywhere, right? Because we are. This is something we are part of the, of we the people, right? We were not in the documents as they were originally created, but until we can come to terms with our history, which is what Baldwin is always calling on us to do, we can't get anywhere. And so, I think that idea, and just one more point on this, and then I'll shut up, is that this idea of allegiance, and this one I've been playing around with, and I talk about a little bit in the conclusion of the book, and I think I want to do more with it in maybe an article or something, is, Baldwin in 1955 has this really powerful sentence that is being quoted a lot now, right? Where Baldwin says that he loves America, and as a lover of America, he reserves the right to criticize her perpetually, right? So he's framing allegiance, patriotism, love in a way that's very foreign to I think the way a lot of folks think about patriotism, and I think there's something about that there's a lot going on there, and love is a very complicated concept for Baldwin that is one that we could talk about all night, but there's something about that. Baldwin is saying, I want to be in a country that has evolved a recognition of my humanity. That's what I'm asking. That is what I'm asking, a recognition of my humanity and a recognition that I am one of the people who built the country. That's central to Baldwin's message, and it's at once extraordinarily simple and extraordinarily profound and complicated.
Yeah.
Nicole Hannah-Jones sort of takes it to the next level, where she says that it is Black people that build America, of course, but also that they are the founding fathers and mothers of this country in 1619 when the first slaves were brought here. But she also says that it's Black people that have believed in America more than anyone else. The fact that Black people are the ones that have worked so hard to make it a more perfect union. It was Black people that brought about the idea of Reconstruction, the 14th Amendment, which so many other issues have come forward. If it wasn't for Black people fighting and getting the 14th Amendment in place, the Equal Protection Clause, you wouldn't have had gay marriage approved today. If you didn't have the Civil Rights Act and that movement that was brought about by Black folks, you wouldn't have all the rights that others have enjoyed since then. So all of these rights was really there to perfect the American Union, and it's Black people that are actually the most patriotic, the people that believed in this country more than anyone else.
Yeah, that's a great point, Andy. I mean, and Baldwin makes this point, in his writings when he's down there in his role as a witness, trying to understand the young folks in the South, who are rising up. And he says, in one of his great pieces about the young protesters, he says, these are the only people in this country who really believe in freedom. Freedom, we have all these banners of freedom, slogans of freedom, whatever. But he's saying these are people who actually believe in the idea of freedom, and they're imagining not just freedom in some sort of sense of, Baldwin, I think, thinks it's important that we examine our history and understand where, how these ideas have evolved over time, but also he's calling on us to reimagine what these ideas mean, right? And that's something I think that, you're absolutely right to bring the 1619 Project into the conversation, right? To reimagine, what these things mean and how we can realize them in the world. And revolution is not something, Baldwin would say to us, that happens one day and we move on. Revolution is an endless enterprise, right? Revolution is something that as individuals and as a collective, we have to be engaged in every single day. And so I think you're exactly right to point out, Baldwin is a kind of founding father, right? Of a revolution, of a perpetual revolution, right? That he's calling on all of us to engage in. And so I think that this idea, and again, to bring, Eddie Glaude's book in, this idea of beginning again, right? This is what we're called upon to begin again. And I think that the African-American tradition, just to one last point, to echo what you said, the African-American tradition provides us with this extraordinarily rich and in some ways incredible set of resources to think about what it means to begin again, to think about what it might mean to live up to these ideals that we espouse so often but fail to realize in practice. As you're saying, Andy, and then my friend Eddie, so Eddie Glaude is one friend, and Melvin Rogers is another friend that I want to mention here. Melvin Rogers is somebody who is working on a book, and I don't want to give too much away about Melvin's book, but you'll have him at the Busboys and Poets when it comes out. And this is one of Melvin's central points. Melvin is one of the most incredible interpreters of the African-American tradition, that we have. And Melvin is really interested in this question: is you have folks who have every reason to not have faith in these ideals, to not have faith in the idea that democracy, that a multiracial democracy, a liberty for all can be realized, who are in fact some of the most, they are digging deep into that tradition and trying to imagine what it might look like to realize those ideals. And so I think there's something there that's extraordinarily important. And of course, it's not unique to the African-American tradition, but it's something that is absolutely, the African-American tradition provides us with an incredible resource to think about these questions.
Very good. Speaking of faith, we have a question from Sarah, who asks, considering that many young people have moved or are moving away from religion these days, do you think that there is a tie between Christianity and the original civil rights movements that is something that is still relevant or useful for obtaining progressive changes that are needed now, such as policing or other civil rights issues? She follows up and says, do we have modern day Baldwins that you think that we should be listening to?
Yeah, well, and I can say something about, some thoughts about Baldwin, based on the research I did for the book, but I definitely, anybody else who wants to jump in on this is, I think, a really important question that everyone can speak to. And I think Baldwin's this extraordinarily complicated character in terms of this question of faith and this question of religion. As Andy mentioned, he's somebody who grows up in a deeply religious household. He's the son of a preacher. His stepfather, who's the only father he ever knew, David Baldwin, is a preacher in Harlem storefront churches. Baldwin himself is a young minister, as we talked about before, and he's somebody who, throughout his life is grappling, right? And in Far Next Time, a good part of that is a story of him grappling with questions of faith, right? Sort of his dramatic conversion experience really into the church, and his dramatic, a conversion experience out of the church. And yet he's somebody who's always, you can't quite get a straight answer from him in terms of this question of, where does he end up on this question of faith, right? He's somebody who is always going to complicate that question when we ask it of him. And I mean, one thing he says, one of the lines, I think it may be in just the aftermath of the debate. He's asked, if, you know, because Buckley accuses him, among other things, of being an atheist, right? And this is one of the sins that he says Baldwin has committed. And Baldwin says, "I'm an unorthodox Christian," right? Is one of the lines that Baldwin uses. And if you look at Baldwin's, you know, Baldwin's career, I mean, one of the most powerful pieces I'd recommend to folks to check out, and you can actually listen to audio of it on the internet, or you can read it in Baldwin's collected essays, is a speech he gives in 1968 to the World Council of Churches. And it's called White Racism or World Community. And Baldwin is there at the World Council of Churches delivering this speech as a replacement for Martin Luther King, because King has been killed. And so you have Baldwin in this room full of, you know, deeply religious folks, right? And he's talking to them about faith, his faith journey, right? And also about what faith ought to mean in the revolutionary struggle. And it's a really powerful, and I think one of the things that comes through very clearly is that Baldwin says, and he says this very explicitly, he says, "I think of Jesus Christ as the most betrayed figure in human history." And he says, what would it mean? And this is where I think it's so powerful to juxtapose him with someone like Buckley, who claims to be this devout believer, right? Baldwin says, what would it mean to treat all human beings as if they were children of God? What a revolutionary idea is that, right? What would it mean to actually act on some of the messages that we find in Scripture? And so Baldwin, you know, in some ways, right, is this, you know, and this is one of the really cool reactions he gets after The Fire Next Time comes out. All these letters come. One of the cool things that I did in the research for the book was read all the mail that the New Yorker got after, you know, the long essay is published in late 1962. And he gets all these letters from people who are just ordinary folks who are reading the book and reacting to it. He also gets, you know, letters from literary celebrities like the Trappist monk Thomas Merton writes to him, you know, "Jimmy, you may have left the church a long time ago, but this is one of the most deeply religious documents I've ever read," right? And a lot of ordinary people have that same response. So there's something about that that's elusive about Baldwin. But I think Baldwin is not somebody who wants to exclude folks who believe. He's always there to ask this question: what role is God playing in your life, and how is your conception of God leading you to treat other people? If your conception of God is leading you to exclude, is leading you to marginalize, then your conception of God has got to go. If God is making you larger and freer and more loving, then I'm all for it. That's how I read Baldwin, and that may be a controversial reading, but that's how I read Baldwin.
That actually, what you're saying speaks to a bit of a question that we also received with this notion of superiority, or this expression of superiority that Buckley has. This question comes from Janethal Shaw, and they ask, how do you reach someone with that ideology? How do you speak to or communicate with, have discourse with someone who presents themselves with this belief of superiority? Not just in white supremacy, but also in their very presence of superiority. I mean, you can see it in Buckley's body language and the way he's holding his hands on his hips, and just the entire discourse of the embodied discourse, as Anna Julia Cooper would say, of a person who is everything about them exudes this sense of superiority.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Janae. I mean, I think that, and I think Baldwin has two answers for us that I think are, you know, they might not be fully compatible, but I think they're really important for us to keep in mind. And I'll, you know, without being too abstract about this, I'll bring them down to earth. Baldwin has simultaneously this incredible, almost superhuman empathy on the one hand, and also this powerful critique on the other, when talking about sort of the people guarding the fortress of white supremacy, let's put it that way. So on the empathy side, I want to say this: Baldwin in the Cambridge speech, one of the most powerful lines, right, is he says that, you know, in that moment, Sheriff Jim Clark, Selma, Alabama, is you know, people are seeing him on television and on newspapers brandishing his cattle prod, using it against men, women, and children in the streets of Alabama who are fighting for their rights. And Baldwin says that when Jim Clark uses his cattle prod, what he's doing to his victim is ghastly. But in some ways, what's happening inside of Jim Clark is much, much worse. Right? Baldwin says there's something of Jim Clark's moral life, Baldwin says, has been destroyed by the plague called color. Jim Clark, his entire conception of who he is bound up in this delusion of white supremacy. His entire understanding of what his role in the world is to protect this fortress of white supremacy. So Baldwin says, this is not, this struggle is about liberating Jim Clark. Jim Clark needs to be liberated, right? He is caught up in a web of that he does not really understand. Now, so that's amazing empathy. I think Baldwin means that. He says that throughout his writing. He absolutely means that. Now, exactly of how to reveal that to Jim Clark is a really complicated story. And one thing Baldwin says in Blues for Mr. Charlie in the notes before, you know, that play on Broadway, there was, you know, that ran just before the Buckley Baldwin debate. He has a Jim Clark character in that book, Lyle Britton. And what Baldwin says is, look, I'm going to be honest with you. We might not be able to save Lyle Britton. We might not be able to save Jim Clark, but perhaps we can save their children. And that's where Baldwin's hope is. You have to, if we do not have that hope, then where are we? And so that's on the one hand. Now, on the other hand, what do we do with people like Buckley? And this is where I think Baldwin is that empathy, right? This is going to take on a different form when he's confronting somebody like Buckley. A little over 2 years before he meets Buckley, Baldwin goes on television in late 1962 and sits across the table from James Jackson Kilpatrick, who was known in those days as the leading salesman for segregation. So Kilpatrick had devoted his professional life to saying all he could, to writing all he could, to defending white supremacy, to defending segregation. And Baldwin is invited to go on television with James Jackson Kilpatrick, who, by the way, was Buckley's go-to guy on race, right? But he wrote for Buckley's magazine all the time. And Baldwin is invited to go on television to debate segregation with Kilpatrick. A lot of Baldwin's friends said, don't do it. You're going to dignify his position by being on that stage, so to speak, with him. But Baldwin felt an obligation to do it. And the reason he felt an obligation was he felt an obligation to expose people like Kilpatrick and people like Buckley for who they were, right? And what he says to Kilpatrick, this is just weeks after the battle at Ole Miss. James Meredith, African-American Air Force veteran, is attempting to enroll in classes at the University of Mississippi, and all hell breaks loose, right? There's rioting, white mobs at Ole Miss. And, you know, the federal troops have to be sent in to quell that rebellion. So Baldwin sits down with Kilpatrick just after that happens, and the first thing he says, they're welcome to the show, he looks Kilpatrick in the eyes, and he says, you think there's a difference between the mobs that we see committing acts of racist violence in the streets and people like you, who wear nice suits and write sophisticated books about segregation. And Baldwin says, there is no difference. In fact, I hold you far more responsible than I hold the people in those streets. They are caught up in webs of delusion that they don't really understand, and you are weaving those webs to enhance your own power. That is what you were trying to conserve. So Baldwin says, I do not accuse you of betraying me, James Baldwin. I accuse you of betraying them. You are destroying the moral lives of people that you claim to be defending. So there's two things there, right? There's that empathy, but then there's also that biting critique. And I think we need both. And I think trying to figure out exactly how to, utilize those in the world in which we live is an ongoing process. And I was talking to somebody recently, I said, really, it's a psychological question in some ways. Like, how do you get to somebody who's taking these views today? And I don't, Charles does conflict resolution, and Charles, probably has some great insights into this, because I don't know, and I don't often do it well, right? Because the point is, right, we do want to move the world closer to justice. So there's a strategic question here that really should matter to all of us.
Well, speaking of strategy, we have a question about how to use James Baldwin quotes over social media, whether in the form of graphics or in the form of video. This person asked, what are the politics and the nuances of using his words to advance narrative change? Because that's what, in a very real essence, we're trying to get at, right? We're trying to get at not Jim Clark, but at his children, right? And so how do we remain respectful to James Baldwin's legacy by using his quotes and his images rather than exploiting it? And then one final question, Emma asks, in beginning your studies for this debate, did you include the film I Am Not a Negro in your preparation for this?
Yeah, and then in some ways, those two questions are related, right? I'm thinking about sort of all the different ways that we can share these ideas, whether it's through Instagram or all these different platforms that we have. And so I absolutely think that and again, I don't claim any expertise in how to get these ideas to sink in, but I do think that any platform we can use to try to share this sort of wisdom is extraordinarily valuable. Like, I'm really happy to see, for example, in the work of Ibram X. Kendi, who I know is a friend of Busboys and Poets. I think Ibram is a model in some ways of trying to utilize every possible form to communicate this extraordinarily important message about what racism is and what anti-racism is. And so I think Baldwin himself, right? Baldwin, he wrote a children's book, right? And that folks should check that out. Baldwin was very interested in, all these, all the medium that were available to him, right? In film, he's interested in music. He's interested in all these different ways in which we can communicate this message. And so, and I do think there's something about, as Andy mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, there's something about Baldwin himself, right, as he's trying, for example, in his fiction, and Andy said, is you reread the fiction and new things occur to you, like that you hadn't thought about before. I had that same experience reading Another Country again, this last couple weeks. Baldwin, through his characters in this really extraordinary way, he tries to inhabit the minds of people, of different sorts of people, and tries to understand, how does this person view the world, and in what ways are they fooling themselves? And of course, from that perch as a novelist, he's able to sort of try to examine our psyches in this really, really powerful way. And then, absolutely, with films, the I'm Not Your Negro, I was working on the book, already when that came out, and of course I was thrilled, and I admired that film very much. And I think it's a kind of film everybody should check out. Barry Jenkins, of course, adapted If Beale Street Could Talk, one of Baldwin's novels, and I also recommend that. Any way we can get this message to people and get people to think about James Baldwin, I think is extraordinarily valuable. So I think that there's a lot of folks younger than I am who are a lot better at creating content that's going to catch the eye of that next generation. But I absolutely think it's crucial that we do that, because Baldwin is somebody who can continue to help us understand the world, and more importantly, help us understand how to change the world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Buccola. We appreciate your time, your insights into to James Baldwin, and sharing these two clips that gave us definitely contrast, but also helped us understand how we as individuals moving towards anti-racist agenda and anti-racist lives can position ourselves to embody discourse in a very real way. And so thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your work. Dr. Chavis, Andy, any closing thoughts for Dr. Buccola and for our audience before we say so long?
Yes, I wanted to say just thank you so much to Dr. Buccola for showing us, reintroducing us to James Baldwin, right? He's one of those figures in which you find yourself learning more and more about him as you engage him each time, right? And so we're so thankful for your work and for your book. But you know, as to that last question, I think we can learn so much from Baldwin, specifically as someone who was able to do both narrative change and promote social transformation simultaneously. I think to the viewer's question, that is what we can learn from him, right? Using every device in terms of, you know, the literary tradition, he was able to promote narrative change, but also critique and connect um, the literature and what he was doing to the current moment and the current struggles that he was witnessing before his eyes and that the world was witnessing. And so that's something I think we can learn from him. And again, we're so thankful for this opportunity from Andy Shallal and on behalf of the Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. We thank you for this opportunity and we hope to do it again. Andy, did you have any a few words also the John Mitchell Jr. program as well?
Yeah, I just want to tell the audience to please stay tuned for other programs that we'll be having coming up. And we are working on a radio show that we're going to be doing on WPFW on Monday nights at 6 p.m. Every Monday at 6 p.m. That'll be launched in September. So we're really excited about that. And this continuing talk on race is going to take many different forms. We'll continue to do the Zoom calls. We'll do them on the radio as well. So we're very excited to work with WPFW to make that a reality. We also do at Busboys and Poets, we do Zoom talks on Fridays. This Friday is going to be Linda Sarsour. She is the co-founder with Tamika Mallory of Until Freedom, which is an organization to find justice for Breonna Taylor specifically. I think, you know, focusing on specifics and specific issues seem to really work and change the narrative that we're talking about here. So thank you, Ajane. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Patrick and Alicia from Busboys and Poets. And thank you so much, Nick. It was just a joy to have you. This will not be the last time you'll get a phone call from me, so I appreciate you.
Oh, good. Thank you all so much. I think you're doing such important work, and I'm so grateful to be a part of it.